Happy Saturday morning, everyone. This is Jason, another edition of Unheralded History. Yesterday I did North Dakota Governor Art Link, and today I'm going to go north of the border here for another man who is in the annals of Canadian history, but is not really talked about very much in this particular day and concept. And that's because he was more of the speak softly and carry a big stick mentality. Now, to anybody who's deeply progressive and on the left, they're going to realize who this is. And I'm just going to say it right now. It is former NDP leader and Premier Saskatchewan Tommy Douglas. And Douglas's imprint on Canadian political history cannot be overlooked. When we talk about the Canadian national healthcare system these days, this was his idea. And Douglas was Premier of Saskatchewan, which is the northern province, actually does border North Dakota as a prairie province. He introduced the universal payer healthcare system in Saskatchewan in the 1950s. Now, Douglas initially started out as a Baptist minister, and he moved to Saskatchewan to take pastorship of a church there in Wyburn, Saskatchewan. And in the town of Wyburn, he and his newly married wife in 1935 initiated a strike against a large energy producer in Saskatchewan, manufacturer as well. So he actually used the pulpit and Christian principles to back his labor activism. And so in 1936, he actually wound up winning an election and stepped away from the pulpit. And he was elected to the House of Commons in 1936. And so Douglas went off to Ottawa and began his service there. Now, he got out of federal politics in the 1940s when he ran for and successfully won the leadership of what was then called the CCP, or the Commonwealth Cooperative Party. The CCP in 1961 then became the New Democratic Party, or today's NDP, in 1961. So Douglas had been Premier of Saskatchewan throughout most of the 1940s and 1960s, but then ran for the federal party leadership of the newly renamed NDP in 1961 and became the first federal leader of the NDP in that year, a post he would continue in until 1971. Now, I've got to go back to Douglas being one of the founders of universal health care in Canada. And how did this occur? Well, of course, as I mentioned here, he did create the provincial model in Saskatchewan throughout much of the 1940s and 1950s. And this was implemented in a guaranteed single-payer healthcare, with the single payer being the province of Saskatchewan itself. He would then take this idea to Ottawa as now named national leader of the NDP, and he would then become basically the founder of Canadian Medicare, which is what the Universal Healthcare Program is actually called there. He is the father of Canadian Medicare. However, his influence and this idea was actually brought together by three men of very differing political viewpoints. Now, Douglas was the spark that created this, system on a provincial level. But then John Diefenbaker, also of Saskatchewan, by the way, who was actually the prime minister at the time in 1961, he had just been elected. He would go on to serve 3 terms as prime minister, but only once with a majority mandate. But Diefenbaker caught wind of this and said, hey, look, here's what we'll do. If any province wants to start this type of a system, the federal government will pay 50% of the costs, and we'll leave the other half to the provinces. This is a move by Diefenbaker that is actually still in play in the current system. And the third man who came into the picture was a opposition leader who would eventually go on to become prime minister himself, and that's Lester Pearson. Now, if that name brings anything to mind, you would be thinking of Toronto's Pearson International Airport, which is named for Lester Pearson. And he would eventually go on to become a Liberal prime minister with a minority mandate. But nonetheless, he was leader of the opposition in 1961. And so he pushed forth legislation that would federally codify both Douglas's system and Diefenbaker's funding mechanisms for it. And so, but because the original idea is Douglas's, it should be, he rightfully gets credit as the father of Canadian Medicare. Now, I don't know what you think of Canadian Medicare. I do think it definitely has a big series of flaws with it. The funding mechanism has gone on to become a problem in the modern day, the Diefenbaker portion of it. But nonetheless, the system was originally piloted, if you will, by Tommy Douglas. One other thing that you will not know about Tommy Douglas is that he has a famous grandson in the United States. And that is actor Kiefer Sutherland. Kiefer Sutherland is the grandson of Tommy Douglas. And remarkably, it's even more stark because given the more socialist leanings of Douglas, the fact that his grandson would go on to play a icon of conservative fans in the form of Jack Bauer on 24, which makes this relationship all the more stark and interesting. That, Sutherland would go on to play a man who is a fan who has many, many fans on the political right in the United States in the form of Jack Bauer. And so, if you ever want to see any kind of autobiographical information on Tommy Douglas, there is a movie that was made about him that I do think was a little bit exaggerated, a little bit in some ways, particularly around the Wyburn labor strike. But if you want to ever look it up, it's called Prairie Giant, which indicates his rise from being a Baptist minister in the small town of Wyburn, Saskatchewan, all the way to being the leader of the he never actually even made it to leader of the opposition in the NDP, but all the way to being the leader of the NDP in the federal government in Ottawa. So it traces him all the way from the mid-1930s to the labor strikes in Wyburn, all the way to his time in Ottawa. Now, the thing to understand about him and the NDP in Ottawa is this. He never was prime minister, never was even reached the leader of the opposition, which, the men that Diefenbaker was prime minister and Pearson was leader of the opposition. So they held the first and second place in the number of seats in the Canadian House of Commons. But Douglas and the NDP held what was called the balance of power, which is that third party, because Diefenbaker did not have a majority government or the majority of the House of Commons seats, he cannot pass legislation without the help of anybody else. So if Diefenbaker and the Conservatives were on opposite sides of an issue with Pearson and the Liberals, Diefenbaker could get the help of Douglas and the NDP to then have enough votes to pass legislation, and therefore, at least in the instance of a single bill, have a majority that would be needed to carry the day. This is what the balance of power means, and even in today's Canadian governments, even in the present day, it can have a lot of power. Now, it's a little different today because the NDP is no longer even a power of any significant substantiation. In the previous election last year, the NDP now only has 7 seats. Now, I could go on and on about why Douglas's party has fallen from grace so far. Some have argued that it's because they're not progressive enough. Others have agreed that their leadership is incompetent. I can see both sides of that. But Douglas was a progressive from a generally a socially conservative province, which of course explains how he got into Saskatchewan to begin with as a Baptist minister. And I don't think Douglas would recognize the left today for what it is, because he obviously held a Christian faith because he made his living off of that. So today's extreme social left would not register with him if you somehow manage to transport him back to the present day. But this is a man who has had an outsized imprint on Canadian history. There's also a document called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which never gained any momentum. It was an idea that the NDP had for quite some time, but never gained a significant amount of traction. Now, Douglas was out of politics by the time this came to pass, which would be in 1986. But Douglas had built the coalition that allowed it to reach that point between his NDP and the Liberals of the day. Now, the Liberal premier at the time, trying to think of who the Liberal premier was in 1986. But the Liberals, regardless, take credit for the Canadian Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to this day. It's basically their version of the American Bill of Rights, which they never had before this. Before 1986, this never existed. But was eventually ratified in 1986. And at this point, this was passed, and also with the help of conservative, and actually the Prime Minister was a conservative at the time, and that was Brian Mulroney. So, again, Douglas built coalitions, even though he was clearly a leftist progressive. We never talk about this, this part of him is almost never discussed. But he was out of federal office by 1986. But nonetheless, this is part of his legacy too, because he initially started the momentum and the coalitions necessary to build that, just like what happened with Canadian Medicare. This is why his place in Canadian history is outsized. And the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, did run a campaign in the late 90s, or not even a campaign, but like an election or ballot in the 1990s, asking who was the greatest ever Canadian. Douglas was the winner. And actually, returning to Canada to present the award for him, and actually, I'm sorry, this was in the late 2000s, not 1990s. But Kiefer Sutherland returned to Canada to present this award on his behalf. And he actually even, filmed short segments about his grandfather and the accomplishments that he had to get there. So he's all over the history books, but he is very underrated because this coalition building aspect of his is almost never mentioned. In today's politics, it's almost never mentioned. He's almost never mentioned. In today's social media influence, polarizing environment, I'm not sure he would have been able to accomplish what he did. But in the more traditional environments, from all the way from his election in 1935 to his to the end of his term as NDP leader in the 1970s, which he actually remained in Parliament until 1978. And actually even railed against the War Measures Act in the Vietnam era. Now, to think that he's a pacifist would actually also be inaccurate. Because once he reached the House of Commons in 1935, he actually advocated for Canada entering the war against Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. So to actually call him a pure pacifist is incorrect. Because he saw that war for what it was, and that is a fight for the survival of Western civilization against a man of intense evil. His words, not mine. Douglas knew that that he represented an existential threat to the human race. And so, even though his actual party leader at the time advocated for staying out of the war, Douglas advocated for entering the war. Now, his party leader of the CCF at the time had also had a stroke. And even though Douglas opposed staying out of World War II, when it came time to present the legislation and the bill to stay out of the World War II, Douglas actually dutifully read the script for his party leader, who by this time was not in the best of shape. And he would have mentally struggled to read the bill aloud on the floor, which in Canada at the time was a requirement. That legislation had to be read on the floor before it was presented to a vote. I wish the free governments would bring that back. But nonetheless, Douglas took the step to read legislation for royal assent on the floor of the House of Commons that he didn't agree with. But because he, wanted to help the man who had actually come to know well, obviously, because he was a member of the House of Commons and that was his party leader at the time. He went against his own belief on a particular subject on the conviction that he needed to help his fellow man. So that is the story, very, very short, of Tommy Douglas. As I said earlier, if you want a more detailed biopic, go into it knowing that it's fairly sensationalized, but historically is reasonably accurate. Look up the documentary Prairie Giant. So anyway, underrated history. CBC's all-time greatest Canadian, Tommy Douglas. I do not know who I'm going to do tomorrow. If you have any suggestions, drop in the comments. I'm obviously not. I can obviously take a joke, but if you So if you have any, I'll take it for what it's worth. But any serious suggestions, I would definitely take. I have some ideas in mind, but I just don't know who I will take. But anyway, guys, you have yourselves a fantastic weekend. Peace out, homies.